They watched us fight, not for power, not for glory, but for something scarier, hope that never dies. They didn't expect to care. When the first signal reached the Galactic Council's data relays, it was dismissed as wartime static, another dying species flailing in the dark. But someone had flagged it. Human transmission, unfiltered, combat, footage. It began looping in the background of the Council's network feed, barely noticed at first, until someone looked closer. No narration, no diplomacy, just raw, unedited footage from the edge of a battlefield. A ridge somewhere on a human colony world. The camera shook as explosions rattled the earth. Screams pierced the static. And yet, no requests for help. No desperate pleas. Just a visual. Record of humans fighting with brutal efficiency, of dying, bleeding, and still refusing to stop. An elder delegate paused mid-sentence during a trade discussion, transfixed by the flickering feed. One by one, other species stopped speaking, watching in silence. Not because of the violence, they had all seen violence, but because of something else, something worse. They watched a human soldier drag his wounded comrade behind a broken carrier, his face smeared with blood, eyes empty. The wounded man laughed through a broken jaw. The two shared a moment, one that said more than any diplomatic speech. Neither expected to survive, but neither stopped moving. Another soldier sprinted across open ground, dodging fire to deliver. A pack of ammunition to a gunner holding a broken line. He took 3 hits mid-run and kept going. Alien diplomats used to peace and sterile wars recoiled. Their species had eradicated conflict centuries ago. They had forgotten what it looked like to fight with no logic, no numbers, only will. More footage rolled in. A medic tied off a field amputation with his own belt, then grabbed a rifle from a corpse and joined the front. Civilians, untrained, terrified, formed human chains to carry supplies under bombardment. A boy no older than 12 hurled grenades over a barricade, covering his injured mother. Still, not a single request for aid, not a whisper of surrender. Just transmission after transmission of humans enduring what no being should. The feed had no filters. The Council, for the first time in centuries, didn't censor it. Couldn't. They needed to understand what they were witnessing. One ambassador, reptilian and ancient, narrowed her eyes. Why are they still fighting? They've already lost the ridge. Another, from a crystal-bonded hive race, tilted his head. Because they still have people behind them. And that's all they need. The human forces on Elion Ridge were cut off. Their reinforcements had been destroyed. Their orbital fleet burned within hours of the enemy's arrival. According to all accepted logic, they should have surrendered. But humanity didn't fight according to logic. They fought because surrender wasn't in their blood, and they made it cost. A captain rallied his remaining squad with nothing more than a glance. They moved like parts of a single being. Cover fire, charge, retreat, fall back, cover again. Patterns improvised in seconds. The kind of synergy no command AI could replicate. It wasn't training. It was instinct born of centuries. Surviving on a death world, the alien watchers didn't understand. Not at first. But slowly, they began to feel it. That dull throb in the gut. Not pity, not horror. Something colder. They watched a woman crawl across no man's land with shattered legs to plant an explosive under a tank-like walker. When it detonated, she screamed one last time, not in pain, but in triumph. They watched a squad hoist their own dead onto makeshift barriers, not to desecrate, but to protect the living from incoming fire. There were no shields left, just flesh and metal. And conviction. Then came the command from the humans higher up. Audio only. A voice like gravel soaked in smoke. Hold the ridge. No fallback. No surrender. Make them pay. Simple. Final. One alien leaned forward, breath shallow. Who are they talking to? No one's left, another replied, voice hollow. They're talking to us. In that moment, the watchers understood this footage wasn't meant to call for help. It was a message, a record, a warning. Humans weren't showing off. They weren't trying to impress. They were showing the truth, what it meant to be human when all hope was gone. And somehow, that was worse. A final clip played before the signal looped again. The last defenders of the ridge gathered behind smoldering wreckage. Dirty, bleeding smiles cracked across broken teeth. They didn't sing. They didn't pray. One simply looked at the camera, held up 2 fingers in a V, and nodded. Then silence. The feed ended. The chamber remained still. For the first time in generations, the council felt something it didn't recognize. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of witnessing something greater than death, something uncontainable, something pure and stubborn and utterly alien. The youngest delegate, barely past his first molt, whispered into the silence. Rewind that. What are they doing? Alien Ridge wasn't strategic. It had no command centers, no artillery, no orbital links. Just dirt, shattered stone, and a trench line dug by exhausted hands. But it stood between the enemy and a valley filled with 10,000 civilians who hadn't made it to evacuation, so the humans made it matter. The first shell hit before dawn. No sirens, just a thunderclap that shook the ground and turned half the forward trench into a crater. The soldiers didn't run. They pulled the wounded back, reset their positions, and returned fire with weapons held together by tape and wire. The command net was broken. Power lines were gone. No air cover, no satellites. All they had were eyes, instincts, and each other. By noon, the enemy advanced. They came in waves, fast, armored, biologically augmented, the kind of force that broke lines in minutes. But they didn't break Alien Ridge. They hit walls of gunfire, homemade mines, and a defense line held by people who no longer feared death. Every human on that ridge knew the cost of holding it, and still, no one left. Private Salas, 18, made 3 runs to the rear trench under fire to bring water and ammunition. On the 4th run, he came back dragging a wounded corporal by his vest. Blood soaked his face, but he kept moving. His commanding officer didn't praise him, just nodded once. That was enough. Sergeant Wren climbed a shattered lookout post, spotted an enemy artillery nest, and relayed coordinates before a blast threw her from the tower. Her last act was to pull the pin on a grenade and roll into the advancing enemy's feet. She didn't scream, just smiled. They heard the pop of the pin on the comms before it went silent. There was no time for speeches, no room for fear, just short, sharp orders shouted over gunfire. A wounded tech jury rigged a signal repeater out of a comms helmet and an old rifle battery. It lasted 12 minutes, long enough to get one last message out. Ridge still holding, civilians safe, no retreat. The enemy adapted. They stopped, charging and started raining down heat-based bombardments, trying to cook the defenders in place. But the humans dug deeper. When the blasts came, they crouched in silence. When they stopped, they rose and returned fire without hesitation. They fought not like soldiers, but like guardians of something sacred. One squad lost half its number and kept fighting with sidearms and hand-thrown charges. Another ran out of bullets and used knives. They didn't yell. They moved with a terrifying calm, eyes locked forward, hearts already past the fear. Pain didn't slow them. Exhaustion didn't stop them. Some were veterans. Most weren't. It didn't matter. In a collapsed side trench, 2 medics worked without gloves, sealing wounds with heat clamps and muttered reassurances. They didn't know the names of the people they were saving. It didn't matter. Every life bought more time for the valley below. Every breath stolen back from death meant the line held a little longer. A fire team flanked a heavy walker with nothing but grenades and grit. They climbed over its armored frame, forcing it to waste time shaking them off, while others lit up its flank with focused fire. The explosion took all of them. But the next wave moved up in the smoke without pause. Night fell. No lights, just cold air and blood on their hands. They passed ration packs hand to hand. No one complained. Someone told a joke. No one laughed. They weren't here for morale. They were here to deny the enemy every inch. At Oro 200 hours, a message came through on a dying frequency. The enemy had broken through 2 adjacent positions. Elion Ridge was surrounded. No reinforcements. No escape. They had minutes left. The captain stood in the dark, face streaked with ash and blood, and gave the last order anyone on the ridge would ever hear. Scatter charges. Hold the ridge. They don't pass. No screaming. No last rites. Just movement. Calm, practiced, relentless. They set the explosives in silence, covered the injured with broken armor, readied their weapons, and waited. When the enemy crested the hill, expecting broken survivors and empty trenches, they found steel and fire. The charges lit up the night, painting the hill in flame. Gunfire thundered, and even as the line collapsed, the defenders didn't fall back. They fought until their hands were empty. Then they fought with fists. When the fists broke, they crawled, dragged themselves toward the enemy and bit and clawed until nothing moved. The enemy took the ridge by dawn. They found no prisoners, no cries, just silence and wreckage. The bodies of the defenders were wrapped in each other's arms, covering the youngest, shielding the wounded. Around them, destroyed gear and cratered earth marked the price of every inch gained. But the valley below, where the civilians had hidden, remained untouched. The defenders had bought the hours needed, with blood, with breath, with everything they had. And they did not ask for thanks. No statues would be built. No parades held. Their names would fade, but someone, somewhere, had seen it all, recorded every second, because someone had to remember what it looked like when humanity was cornered and chose to fight anyway. They thought humans would break. The first contact protocols were written with confidence. Humanity was classified as young, aggressive, emotionally unstable, and technologically inferior, perfect candidates for subjugation. The invasion fleet approached Earth and its colonies with surgical precision. Plans predicted total collapse within weeks. What they encountered instead made them rewrite every assumption about warfare. At first, humans ran. Civilians evacuated. Military units fell back from outer positions. It was mistaken as cowardice. The enemy pushed harder, believing resistance would shatter under pressure. Then the ambushes started. Forest fires lit by human saboteurs engulfed. Drop zones. Rivers were dammed, then released to drown armored vehicles. Soldiers allowed themselves to be seen, drew the enemy in, then vanished into smoke and shadow. It wasn't organized resistance, it was chaos with intent. Drones recorded. Humans using terrain like weapons. Mud became traps. Buildings became kill boxes. What looked like desperation was calculated rage. They didn't attack head-on. They waited, watched, struck when it mattered. An enemy commander recalled a night raid where human forces crawled through the undergrowth and slit the throats of guards without making a sound. They didn't retreat after. They left symbols on the walls in blood, not threats, warnings. In the first month, the invaders lost more soldiers to psychological strain than combat. Their species operated on logic and symmetry. Humanity was none of those things. They attacked while wounded. They baited with corpses. They laughed under fire. One drone broadcast showed a human pinned under rubble. When approached, he detonated a grenade under his own body, killing himself and 3 surrounding enemy units. It wasn't mindless self-destruction. It was commitment, with teeth. Interrogated prisoners revealed nothing of value, not because they didn't know, but because they refused. One broke his own jaw to prevent the enemy from scanning his vocal patterns. Another bit down on a capsule not to die, but to erase data in his neural link. They planned to lose, but made every loss burn. The invaders began calling human special forces the Black Noise. They'd strike without sound, appear where they couldn't be, vanish without explanation. They fought with tools the enemy didn't understand. improvised weapons, guerrilla tactics, and unpredictable emotion. One of the enemy commanders wrote in his log, "They grieve and fight at the same time. They rage even as they fall. Their pain becomes fuel, not weakness. We don't understand them, and that terrifies me more than their weapons." A campaign to capture Earth's second colony failed spectacularly. The invasion force took the capital. Within hours, then found themselves hunted block by resistance fighters. Children planted charges in sewer lines, doctors poisoned supply crates, elderly civilians mapped sniper routes and passed intelligence through coded lullabies. The enemy tried to install fear suppression protocols across their army to stabilize morale. It failed. Reports spread too fast. Soldiers began refusing to engage. Some retreated entirely, citing irrational threat responses caused by human war behavior. A captured alien soldier broke under questioning, not from pain, but from memory. He said a human unit let him live, fed him, let him believe he'd escaped, then released him back with a tracking device buried in his skin. He led his battalion into an ambush that left nothing but ash. The final thing he heard was the laughter of the humans who let him go. He called them screamers in the dark. Humanity didn't just fight to win, they fought to unnerve. They broke every pattern the invaders trusted. One minute they begged for mercy, the next they slaughtered an entire regiment. They left behind notes, drawings, crude jokes carved into walls next to ruined tanks. Entire invasion fleets began adapting not to crush, but to contain. Their new objective was to keep humans from reaching strategic zones, not because they couldn't be stopped, but because stopping them cost too much. On one moon, a squad of 7 humans held a tunnel system for 6 days against nearly 200 attackers. When finally cornered, they collapsed the caverns on themselves, killing their pursuers along with them. Weeks later, their encrypted comms were decoded. Inside were personal messages, combat data, and detailed records of enemy weaknesses. Even in death, they were strategic. The phrase "human presence detected" began to trigger preemptive withdrawals. Entire species started avoiding Earth-aligned systems. Colonies left messages at their borders. "We are not involved. We are not human. Please pass." No amount of superior firepower could account for the human will to inflict damage even in defeat. They fought not to survive, but to remind. Every engagement etched the same truth into the minds of their enemies. Humans never stopped, not when losing, not when dying, not even when nothing remained but spite. A turning point came when the enemy captured a human command ship. Inside, instead of prisoners or fleeing officers, they found the crew dead by their own hands. The ship was set to explode if unauthorized access occurred. It did. The blast erased 2 adjacent vessels. The humans had built defeat into their plan. What made them terrifying wasn't technology. It was conviction. Not that they were unkillable, but that they refused to die quietly. That every act of aggression against them was met with something colder, older, something the invaders didn't know how to kill. They called them monsters. But then they looked closer and realized humanity was still holding back. His name wasn't listed in any public database, no celebratory holograms, no titles spoken in pride, just a simple designation whispered in command circles like a myth: General Kale. To most, he didn't exist. To the soldiers on the ground, he was the reason they still had orders. The enemy called him the ghost strategist. He wasn't a hero. He was a consequence. Before the war, he was a writer, a known poet. He vanished from public life the day Earth lost its first colony. When he resurfaced, he had command over fleets, ground forces, and Black Ops divisions. No one knew who gave him that authority. No one questioned it, not even the politicians. He never gave rousing speeches, no hope-filled monologues. His voice was calm, level, and direct. Every order he gave had only one focus: consequence. He didn't speak in maybes. His plans didn't include escape routes. They were written with finality. His officers understood. So did his enemies. One operation under his command involved detonating a series of fusion cores in orbit around a strategic station. The blast destroyed half the human fleet, but took out the enemy's flagship and ended a campaign that had raged for months. When asked about the cost, Cale responded with a single line. "We trade lives for futures, as always." He didn't wear medals. His uniform was stripped of insignia, but his eyes said everything. Cold, unreadable, not out. Of apathy, out of calculation. He weighed every life like a surgeon, not with cruelty, with necessity. Some accused him of being inhuman. But those who served under him knew otherwise. He remembered every name, every unit lost, every failure. He just didn't flinch. Because flinching cost time. Time cost lives. He taught commanders not to mourn in the moment, mourn after, fight now. His most controversial decision was codenamed Black Halo. A civilian outpost on a moon was about to be overrun. No defense force, no escape. Kyle authorized the deployment of a classified weapon, radiation-triggered entropy bombs. The enemy was obliterated. So was the moon's atmosphere. 4,000 civilians lost. When the council demanded answers, Cale didn't deny it. He submitted his own name for war crimes investigation. The file was never opened, because without Black Halo, the core system would have fallen. Cale knew it. The council knew it. They just didn't want to admit they needed someone willing to do what others wouldn't. He wasn't beloved, but he was followed. Not out of loyalty, but out of clarity. Soldiers understood what he represented. If he ordered a mission, it meant no one else would come later. No backups, no redos. It would be done right, or everyone would die trying. His battle strategies became unpredictable by design. He changed tactics faster than simulations could predict. He ordered attacks in weather no sane commander would allow. He rotated unit positions so often, enemy intelligence couldn't track patterns. Sometimes he'd send decoy units to die just to buy seconds. And those units volunteered, because they believed in his math. Cold math that worked. One infamous engagement on the frozen plains of Virel saw Cale order a retreat of the main force, then detonate the ice sheet beneath the pursuing army. The water flash froze, trapping the enemy in crystal tombs. It cost him 300 lives. It saved a continent. His briefings were always the same: a map, a list of probabilities, and a single closing sentence. This is the cost. If you accept it, move forward. He never raised his voice, never shouted over chaos. He didn't have to. Presence alone carried command. His soldiers didn't see him as a savior. They saw him as inevitability. The man who had already calculated every death, weighed it, and still said, "Go." To his enemies, he was a ghost, a force without face or origin. They began deploying entire units just to intercept him. Failed every time. Because Cale didn't lead from the rear. He appeared where outcomes were most unstable. The closer the loss, the more likely he was present. His armor bore no markings, just matte black plates, scarred from a dozen campaigns. His sidearm had more confirmed kills than most fleets. Even off the field, he planned offensives like a composer. Every strike tied to another, every withdrawal a delayed counterattack. He wrote death into rhythm, made horror into a language the enemy couldn't read. Despite everything, he wasn't cruel. He didn't enjoy it. He simply refused to flinch. And that, more than anything, frightened those who watched from afar. An intercepted transmission once caught him speaking to a junior officer who hesitated to execute a high-risk maneuver. She asked what would happen if they failed. He responded, "Then you make failure useful." His philosophy wasn't victory, it was purpose. Make every loss cost them. Make every breath buy time. If we fall, let it be forward. That's why his name wasn't shouted in crowds or printed in headlines. It was written in the dirt where soldiers bled. Whispers between units facing death. Not hope, not salvation. Just the certainty that someone somewhere was still calculating how to win. He didn't believe in glory, only in memory. He once said, "If we survive, history will forget me. If we fail, they'll blame me. Either way, they'll remember why we fought." And in that silence between battles, when soldiers stared into the dark, wondering if they could hold, they didn't ask for miracles. They asked if Cale still breathed. If he did, they fought. The footage didn't stay contained. At first, it was just background data among diplomatic channels, reviewed by military analysts and ignored by politicians. But one station worker leaked a clip. 30 seconds of a human soldier dragging a wounded comrade through fire, shouting coordinates, laughing through the pain. It spread faster than any official statement ever could. Within hours, it was trending across thousands of systems. Broadcasts translated it into dozens of languages. Civilian networks that typically showed entertainment and commerce started airing. Clips titled simply, "Human War Recordings." Viewership skyrocketed. What began as curiosity turned into obsession. No narrator, no commentary. Just the raw feed of a species doing the unthinkable. Audiences were divided. Some couldn't watch more than a few minutes without recoiling. Others were drawn in, eyes wide, searching for something they didn't understand. A common question emerged in forums across the galaxy. Why are they still fighting? Military leaders across neutral systems ordered official reviews. The conclusion was consistent. Humanity had exceeded all projections for resistance, not in firepower, not in numbers, but in persistence. They didn't stop when losing. They didn't retreat when outmatched. They fought beyond logic. On the core world of a pacifist species that had banned weapons centuries ago, a group of university students held a silent vigil after watching a recording of a human child shielding her siblings during a bombardment. Flowers were left outside their parliament with a message: "We can no longer pretend not to see." Elsewhere, some governments tried to suppress the footage, calling it dangerous propaganda. But the effect backfired. The more they tried to shut it down, the more it spread. Underground networks formed solely to archive and analyze human battlefield. Transmissions. Compilations were made, tributes edited with mournful music. One particularly viral clip showed a group of wounded soldiers forming a last line and writing their names into the dirt before dying. It broke planetary viewership records. Media began hosting debates. Some hailed the humans as symbols of courage. Others saw them as unstable threats, but all agreed on one point. What they were witnessing was unlike any conflict the galaxy had. Recorded in recent history, civilians across several species began posting public statements. If we were attacked, we'd want humans on our side. They fight like we dream. They bleed and don't stop. A new term entered popular culture, human standoff. It meant holding firm when all logic said to flee. In trade hubs and border colonies, military recruitment surged. Not from fear of invasion, but from a desire to understand what made humans so relentless. Entire academies rewrote their training simulations to include human scenarios. Officers who had dismissed Earth as irrelevant began requesting briefings on human history, psychology, and tactics. Meanwhile, the enemies of humanity watched the same footage with growing unease. Their soldiers grew hesitant. Commanders noticed an increase in requests for psychological support. Veterans who'd seen humans up close refused to return to the front. They didn't fear the weapons. They feared what came after, the refusal to die properly, the willingness to make every death count. The footage continued to update. New transmissions from frontline recorders showed deeper horrors. Cities held for weeks without supplies, makeshift hospitals operating in collapsed buildings, soldiers singing to the dying, children helping reload rifles. It wasn't propaganda, it wasn't clean or glorified, it was raw survival, and it wasn't stopping. In the highest circles of galactic leadership, emergency meetings were called. Some argued to intervene on behalf of the humans, to offer aid or at least recognition. Others pushed for containment. They didn't want the war to spread. More importantly, they didn't want human ideology infecting their populations, because that's what it had become, not just war. An idea. That weakness didn't equal surrender. That pain didn't equal silence. That you could lose everything and still keep fighting. Artists across systems began depicting human soldiers in murals, not as conquerors, but as stormwalkers, figures who moved through fire and refused to vanish. Children wore replica armor, songs were written. One popular ballad repeated the line, "They don't ask to be saved, they ask to be remembered." Alien veterans from long past wars admitted they'd never seen a species like this. Not in 10,000 years. One wrote anonymously, "They bleed for each other, not for glory, not for territory. They bleed because the person next to them would do the same." Humanity had become a mirror, reflecting everything others feared they lacked. The footage didn't glorify death. It reminded them of what it meant to stand for something even when standing meant dying. And in that reminder, many felt shame. Some feared what would happen if humans won. Others feared what would happen if they lost. Either outcome would change. The order of the galaxy. A species willing to fight until extinction couldn't be ruled, bargained with, or erased. They could only be remembered or feared. One analyst put it best in a quiet broadcast just before the feed cut. "We expected humans to be loud, to beg, to surrender, but they did something worse. They endured. And now the whole galaxy is watching." The turning point didn't come with a decisive battle or political deal. It came with silence. The enemy fleet pushed into the Terran core expecting crumbling defenses. Instead, they found radio silence, abandoned satellites, and empty orbital platforms. For days, they advanced unchecked, puzzled by the lack of resistance. Until they reached Mars, they were not met by ships or soldiers, but by a wall of debris, repurposed mining rigs, orbital stations chained together, ancient weapons welded onto relics of industry. It wasn't a fleet. It was defiance made physical. A graveyard of machinery waiting to die slowly if it meant slowing the enemy down. Their ships tried to burn through the blockade. They succeeded, but it took too long, and the price in fuel, lives, and morale far exceeded projections. They moved on toward Earth, confident the humans had spent their last defense. Then came the counterattack. Not from the front, from behind. Human. Strike teams had infiltrated their supply lines, hacking fuel routes, disabling communications, and boarding ships mid-jump. Not to win battles, just to cause chaos. Their tactics ignored every rule of war the enemy had relied on for centuries. No formal declaration, no safe zones, no timeline, just constant, unpredictable pressure. The enemy's admirals held emergency conferences. They couldn't predict human patterns. They didn't even understand what the humans were trying to do. They weren't defending planets. They were defending each other. That made every outpost, every squad a potential trap. Entire fleets started refusing orders to advance without reinforcement. The humans had them second-guessing their own victories. One admiral noted in frustration that humans didn't just attack, they haunted. Appear, strike, vanish. Appear again where they had no right to be. The term ghost war started spreading through the ranks, not officially, but in whispers. Command tried to deny it, but the fear had taken root. Captured enemy officers were interrogated. Some didn't respond at all. Others muttered phrases in broken Terran language, words picked up from intercepted human transmissions. Hold the line. No retreat. We are the wall. These weren't military slogans. These were personal vows heard in dying breaths, screamed across burning corridors, passed between survivors like gospel. It became clear that humanity wasn't fighting for victory. They were fighting to deny the enemy peace. Even if Earth fell, even if every system burned, they would make sure it wasn't worth it. That terrified them more than any fleet, because war, to them, was a means to an end. To humans, it had become the end itself. Small victories by the enemy began to feel hollow. Every outpost they took was rigged to explode or poisoned. Every human body recovered was booby-trapped or encoded with false data, drawing forces into more ambushes. The more ground they gained, the more stretched they became, the more they bled. Deserter rates skyrocketed. Elite divisions started requesting reassignment. Morale algorithms broke down trying to account for the emotional toll. Soldiers would stare at human battle footage and ask, "What kind of species keeps going like this?" Back on the homeworlds of the enemy empire, riots broke out. Families demanded their leaders pull back. Protesters wore human symbols in solidarity, not because they loved humanity, but because they feared what their own people had awoken. A growing faction within the enemy council began to question the war's purpose. It had started as expansion, an easy campaign to secure resources and dominance. But now, they were bleeding resources into a furnace of willpower. Every attempt to crush humanity only made them harder to kill. A high-ranking advisor leaked a transcript from a classified meeting. In it, a general confessed, "We didn't invade a world. We invaded a species that had nothing left to lose. And that makes them the most dangerous enemy we've ever faced. Even captured territory couldn't be held. Civilians left behind didn't beg for mercy. They sabotaged food, power, and even their own homes to prevent the enemy from feeling safe. Children served as lookouts. Elderly citizens refused evacuation just to give intelligence on troop movements. It wasn't a military campaign. It was a population on fire. The enemy tried propaganda, broadcasting messages of mercy, promising peace and safety. But humans didn't respond. They simply stared through the screens, unmoved, unreadable. That was worse than rage. Indifference meant they had nothing left to fear. An intercepted message from a human general summed it up in 5 words. "You are already too late." That message spread through the enemy's ranks like a virus. Even their AI struggled to calculate the psychological impact. Analysts predicted a full collapse of frontline efficiency if the war continued for another cycle. All across the galaxy, observers watched the cracks deepen. Some feared retaliation from the humans if they won. Others feared what might happen if they lost. Because either way, the war had changed the balance of power, not just through territory or weapons, but through perception. Humans had proved that survival was a choice, and surrender to them was not in their nature. Their enemies began seeing ghosts in every corridor. Rumors spread of ships lost without combat, of entire crews disappearing after responding to distress signals. Whether true or not didn't matter. Belief had taken root. And belief, as the humans had proven, was a weapon no one could calculate. They thought cutting off Earth's supply lines would end the war. No reinforcements, no fuel, no food, no future. But the humans adapted again. Where others needed fresh resources, humans recycled. Where others relied on centralized logistics, humans decentralized everything. Fleets functioned as mobile factories. Troops harvested battlefield scrap to build new weapons. Entire outposts ran on salvaged alien tech, reverse-engineered and rigged together in days. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Their adaptability wasn't just a trait, it was a tactic. Enemy commanders realized too late that every time they deployed a new strategy, humans didn't just respond. They learned, improved, turned it back against them. Stealth jammers, humans hacked them. Bioplagues, humans developed resistance faster than models predicted. AI-based predictive warfare, Humans fed it false patterns, luring fleets into traps. Every loss the humans suffered became a blueprint for their next move. They didn't fear defeat. They harvested it. This wasn't war as the enemy knew it. It was evolution, violent, merciless, and continuous. Commanders began to say in hushed tones, "The humans are already fighting the next war while we're still in the last one." Enemy morale broke not because they lost ships, but because they lost meaning. Victories didn't feel like progress. Each conquered world drained more than it gave. Strategic gains became liabilities. Maintaining control meant constant vigilance, and no soldier could relax, not even in their own barracks. Human infiltrators didn't strike for territory. They struck for fear. They wanted the enemy to lose sleep, to question every shadow. And they succeeded. Reports of human operatives disguised as enemy medics, mechanics, even diplomats sent paranoia, skyrocketing. Internal purges began. Loyalty screenings intensified. Soldiers reported hallucinations, dreams of faceless Terran warriors walking calmly through fire, untouched, unkillable. Some begged for reassignment to less infected regions. But there were no safe fronts anymore. Humanity had turned the whole war zone into a psychological weapon. Their allies began to waver. Lesser species who had joined the invasion for profit or protection now reconsidered. They watched as entire battalions vanished into asteroid fields or crumbled under human guerrilla tactics. Neutral factions, once silent, began to offer humanity covert aid, not out of friendship, but out of fear. They'd rather feed the fire than be consumed by it. Even nature itself seemed to favor the humans. In toxic environments, they thrived in sealed suits and brutal endurance. In zero gravity, they moved like predators, calm and efficient. On hostile worlds with burning winds or acidic rain, human outposts endured longer than expected. Reports emerged of squads surviving weeks with no contact, then reappearing behind enemy lines, gaunt but unbroken, eyes sharp with that same terrifying resolve. It was no longer just soldiers fighting. Human scientists unleashed viral misinformation into enemy systems, corrupting archives, planting false histories, rewriting their own myths into enemy culture. Enemy children began to ask questions no one could answer. Why do the humans never stop? Why do they smile when they're losing? Why do they keep singing in the dark? Because humans did sing, even as worlds burned, songs of earth, of home, of the dead they honored by refusing to surrender. Their songs weren't cheerful. They were raw, mournful, powerful, and when intercepted, they did more damage than missiles. Because they weren't just sounds, they were statements. Humanity remembered every name lost, every city razed, and they didn't want peace. They wanted memory, memory etched in fire. Enemy propaganda broke under the weight of truth. Every time they claimed victory, humans leaked footage showing the cost. Not to cry for help, but to remind them. We're still here, and we're still watching. Commanders tried to censor it, but their own troops sought it out. They wanted to understand what they were fighting against. And what they found scared them more than any statistic, because humanity wasn't angry. They were determined, and determination can't be bombed, can't be outmaneuvered, can't be reasoned with. The Council finally convened a war summit to reevaluate. What began as a single offensive had become a generational crisis. Their projections failed not because they underestimated firepower, but because they misunderstood will. They assumed humans feared death. Instead, humans feared forgetting, and that made every human soldier a monument. New weapons were tested. Planet-scale disintegration beams, nanoviruses, quantum fracture bombs, all launched, all countered. Because while the Council pushed science forward, humanity pushed meaning forward. Each superweapon used only validated the humans' claims. The enemy would do anything to erase them, and humanity responded with silence, then violence, then silence again. It was no longer about territory. It was about message. Every Terran counterstrike was a declaration. We remember. We endure. We return. A pattern emerged. Human fleets didn't attack at random. They struck sites tied to history, museums, memorials, burial grounds, not to destroy them, but to protect them. They turned their past into armor, every ancestor's name a shield, every fallen hero a warning, captured communications revealed, strange rituals, human units pausing in battle to speak the names of the dead, to honor the lost before charging forward, not as weakness, as fuel. And the enemy couldn't match it, couldn't fake it, couldn't kill it. Because fear wasn't their weapon anymore, it was humanity's. They began to understand why humans could not be defeated. Not because of superior weapons, though they had forged some of the deadliest. Not because of sheer numbers, though their population was vast. It was because their minds operated on a plane foreign to the council species. Humans didn't view war as a contest of force. They viewed it as a crucible for meaning. Every loss was a lesson, every death, a vow, every victory, a burden. Other species fought for conquest or ideology. Humans fought because they couldn't accept erasure, and they made sure the universe couldn't forget them either. Alien generals attempted to adopt human tactics. They tried asymmetric warfare, feigned retreats, psychological attacks, but without the human mindset, the same tools failed. Discipline without purpose cracked, fear without faith collapsed. The aliens began to fracture from the inside, units disobeying orders, commanders doubting strategy. Even as humans absorbed brutal losses, they rallied again and again, emerging stronger each time. Rumors spread that human soldiers didn't die like others, that they fought even after wounds should have ended them. Some believed it was technology, others believed it was madness. But those who faced them up close saw something worse. It was belief, a belief that no world, no life, no legacy would vanish unnoticed. That if they had to carve remembrance into the stars with blood, so be it. Their enemies couldn't comprehend a species that turned grief into fuel. In their cultures, loss was something to be buried, mourned, forgotten. For humans, it was sacred. Not one battle passed without soldiers speaking names of the fallen. Not one victory was celebrated without invoking those who paid for it. This created a depth of resolve the enemy couldn't match. They had no such rituals, no such roots. Their soldiers fought for orders. Humans fought for ghosts. As the war dragged into its third cycle, something stranger began to happen. Alien defectors, not out of alliance, out of fear. Prisoners of war who surrendered started warning their own species. Don't make them come here. Not because humans would destroy their worlds, but because they would make them remember. Entire enemy colonies, untouched by battle, began requesting neutrality. They would rather isolate themselves than draw the attention of Earth. No human had even landed there, but their legend preceded them. Propaganda no longer worked. Human songs, poems, even dying speeches leaked into alien networks. Each one more haunting than the last. An intercepted broadcast showed a single human soldier, surrounded, wounded, moments from death. But instead of pleading, he laughed, not cruelly, not madly, genuinely. He whispered into his comms, "They still think this matters." Then he detonated, taking the entire squad with him. That footage spread faster than any threat ever could. Alien tacticians tried to spin it as terrorism. But their own troops saw something else. Freedom. The freedom to choose defiance over despair. The freedom to give death meaning. Humans did not fear destruction. They feared insignificance. And that made every one of them a living rebellion. The council convened again, not for military strategy, but cultural analysis. They pored over human literature, myth, history. What they found terrified them more than any weapon. Stories of Earth's wars, tragedies, genocides, civil collapse, environmental ruin, And still, they had endured. They had rebuilt from ashes so many times that ruin became a chapter, not a conclusion. Earth had been drowned, scorched, starved, divided, and yet always reborn. Their greatest strength wasn't resilience. It was memory weaponized. Pain turned into foundation. That's what no other species had. That's what made humanity unshakable. Alien historians proposed a radical idea that humans had evolved to lose. That loss was so integrated into their civilization, their psyche, their art, that survival became a ritual of proving they could rise again. Victory, to them, wasn't the end. It was the start of the next test. Other species collapsed after one or two existential threats. Humans had cataloged dozens and wore them like armor. That explained the songs, the names, the unbreakable drive. Each new war wasn't a tragedy. It was a chance to prove they'd earned the right to stand. It was then that the Council issued its first formal order of retreat. Not surrender, just strategic withdrawal. They told their citizens it was temporary, a pause, but internally they knew it was the beginning of the end. You can't win against an enemy that grows stronger with every strike. You can't defeat a people who plant their dead like seeds. Human forces didn't chase them immediately. They consolidated, reinforced, prepared, not out of mercy, out of purpose. They knew the enemy would return, or someone else would, and they would be ready, because that's what Earth had taught them. That peace was just the quiet between tests, that the stars weren't a haven, they were a challenge. A gauntlet of forgotten empires, broken alliances, and hungry powers, and they would not be caught unprepared again. From that moment, human war doctrine changed. No longer reactive, it became proactive. They studied every defeated enemy, mapped every psychological weakness, every strategic oversight. They didn't gloat, they documented, they taught their children. In human academies, soldiers no longer only trained for battle, they trained to carry history. The next war would not be won with firepower alone, but with the weight of legacy. The enemy had finally understood what they were truly fighting against. Not soldiers, not ships, not weapons. They were fighting memory, and memory never surrenders. They tried to forget. The Council, the allied species, the remnants of empires that once believed themselves eternal, they tried to erase humanity from their thoughts, from their records. For a brief time, it worked. The front lines grew cold. No new battles broke out. Planets no longer burned. But peace, in the shadow of fear, is not peace at all. It is paralysis. And while the rest of the galaxy tried to forget, humans did not. They remembered every name, every sacrifice, every scream that had echoed in the void. To them, the silence was not a relief. It was a warning. Back on Earth, they didn't rebuild in celebration. They rebuilt in vigilance. Every ruined outpost, every shattered station was reconstructed with one goal: never be caught off guard again. Their engineers innovated faster than any civilization had in recorded history. Their young no longer dreamed of peace. They prepared for survival, not out of hatred, but out of duty. Humanity did not wish for war. They only wished never to be silenced again. That distinction was what made them terrifying. Most species fought for dominance or revenge. Humanity fought to be remembered. Diplomatic channels reopened. Quietly, tentatively, former enemies approached Earth not with threats, but with offers. Trade, science, knowledge sharing. Humanity accepted, but always on their terms. They didn't ask for reparations. They didn't demand apologies. They demanded truth. Every agreement began with remembrance. Names of fallen colonies recited aloud, records of attacks acknowledged, consequences understood. This was the new diplomacy of humans. Memory before alliance. The council called it extreme. Humans called it honest. Still, among the stars, whispers spread. Not all species feared humanity. Some admired them. Some even sought to join them, not through conquest but through understanding. Fringe civilizations, long oppressed by the council's order, saw in humans a mirror, a people who had bled, broken, but never disappeared. They reached out, not with weapons, but with stories, and humanity listened. Slowly, a new kind of coalition formed, not of power, but of purpose. Species bound by survival, forged through loss, united not in trust, but in shared memory. But not everyone welcomed this shift. Deep within the spiral arms of the galaxy, the old powers festered. Those who had lost the war with Earth began to rearm, not with fleets, but with ideology. A quiet alliance of silence. A coalition that promised to erase history, to suppress memory, to return to the illusion of control. They called humanity dangerous not because of what they did, but because of what they refused to forget. They claimed the galaxy couldn't function with a species that turned every scar into scripture. They said peace required forgetting. Humans responded, peace without truth is just denial. Intelligence reports reached Earth, movements in the dark, fleets reassembling, propaganda spreading across neutral systems. Once again, the warning signs of war. But this time, humanity didn't panic. They didn't shout. They prepared. Quietly, ruthlessly, precisely. They didn't just ready weapons. They readied memory. Every soldier trained not only in tactics, but in legacy. Every commander briefed not only on strategy, but on the cost of forgetting. They wouldn't fight just to survive. They would fight to make sure no one could ever pretend it didn't happen. Then came the spark. A human listening post near the galactic rim went silent. Evidence pointed to sabotage. No lives lost, no structures destroyed, just erasure. Like it had never existed. That, to humans, was a declaration of war, not because of the loss of data, but because someone had tried to make them forget, and that was the one act humanity would never tolerate again. This time, they didn't wait. A task force was dispatched, not to retaliate, but to reveal. They exposed the hidden alliance, decrypted their communications, broadcast their plans to the galaxy. Not just their intentions, but their ideology, the desire to rewrite history, to return to ignorance, to burn the pages of the past. Humanity didn't counter with threats. They responded with stories, the names of every human lost in the last war, images of destroyed cities, testimonies from survivors, not to stir anger, but to inoculate against silence. Something changed then. The galaxy responded, not with fear, but with shame. Civilizations that had once turned a blind eye now stood up, not for humanity, but for memory. They understood now what was truly at stake. This wasn't a war of weapons. It was a war for the soul of history. A war over whether suffering would be acknowledged or buried. And the galaxy, for the first time, chose remembrance. Still, the hidden alliance moved forward. They launched coordinated attacks, not against humans directly, but against records, libraries, archives. They sought to erase the past before humanity could defend it. But they were too late. Earth had learned. Every memory was duplicated, encrypted, scattered across 100 systems, carved into asteroid walls, embedded into starship cores, etched into biological DNA. The truth was now viral, living, impossible to erase. The enemy had thought data was fragile. They hadn't realized humanity had turned it into blood. In response, humanity didn't just fight back. They expanded, not to conquer, but to remember louder. Every liberated world received memory beacons, monuments that told the story, not just of humanity, but of the galaxy's hidden pain, lost species, forgotten atrocities, buried revolutions. They dug it all up, and made the stars remember. It was the opposite of empire. Not control, but exposure. And the more they revealed, the more allies they gained. Not out of fear, but out of the shared need never to be silenced again. The enemy's last weapon was doubt. They seeded messages claiming humanity was fabricating pain, that their stories were exaggerated, that the past wasn't as dark as claimed. But humans had proof. Witnesses, records, survivors, too many to suppress. The truth was messy, but undeniable. And the more the enemy tried to discredit it, the more the galaxy turned against them. Because they weren't just denying humanity's suffering, they were denying everyone's. In the end, the war didn't end in fire. It ended in confession. The last leaders of the Silence Alliance broadcast an apology, not to humans, but to their own people. They admitted their fear, not of death, but of truth. And the galaxy listened and remembered because humans had taught them that fear, when faced, becomes history. And history, once spoken, can never be silenced again. They didn't celebrate, not when the enemy surrendered, not when the broadcasts ended, not when the memory beacons lit up every world touched by the war. Victory to humans wasn't something to cheer. It was something to carry. And what they carried was heavier than any medal, parade, or monument. It was the burden of being the species that remembered too much, the ones who looked into the abyss and chose not to blink, who didn't just survive the darkness, but forced the stars to acknowledge it. Across the galaxy, things shifted, slowly, uneasily, but undeniably. The council was gone, its authority shattered not by fleets or assassinations, but by irrelevance. Its old chambers stood empty, abandoned by those who once obeyed it without question. In its place, a new gathering began, not a government, but a forum, open, rotating, raw, a place where every species, regardless of power or past, could speak their truth. Its founding principles weren't unity or order. They were remembrance and honesty. Two things the old order had feared. Two things humanity demanded. Humans didn't take leadership. They refused to. They had no interest in ruling others, but their voice became the one others turned to when silence threatened to creep back in. Because people trusted those who had, bled for the truth, who had no incentive to lie about pain, who didn't want control, only clarity. And that made humanity something no empire had ever been, trusted without force, followed without fear. New generations were born across war-torn systems. Some had never seen Earth. Others had grown up on ships, learning about the battles not as myth, but as memory. For these children, humanity wasn't a legend. It was a lesson. They weren't taught that humans were invincible. They were taught that humans were unyielding when truth mattered. That humans didn't fight because they loved violence, but because they feared forgetting more than dying. Cultural exchanges bloomed. Not of art or music first, but of grief. Memorials became shared spaces. Species who had once fired on each other stood side by side, not asking for forgiveness, but sharing names of the lost. It was awkward, raw, emotional, but real. And in that honesty, something profound happened. The galaxy didn't just recover. It grew. Not through technology or trade, but through understanding of what it meant to lose, to endure, and to ensure it never happened again. Earth's own culture evolved. Museums turned into archives that connected with systems across light years. Soldiers were remembered not just for bravery, but for witness. Survivors were honored not for toughness, but for testimony. Monuments displayed not victory, but the consequences of silence. And above all, every generation was taught the cost of ignorance. Humanity had learned, at terrible price, that the real enemy was never aliens or fleets. It was apathy, denial, the willingness to let horror fade for the sake of comfort. And so they guarded memory like other species guarded borders. They embedded stories in satellites, encoded history into songs, sent archives drifting into deep space in case Earth ever fell again. They turned their greatest weakness, their small numbers, their mortality, into strength by ensuring that even if every human died, their truth would remain. Other species followed. Memory became weaponized, not for destruction, but for defense. The more honest a civilization was about its past, the more others trusted them. Worlds began rating themselves not by GDP, but by historical transparency. The more scars a planet admitted to, the more allies it gained. Truth became currency, and humanity, without planning to, had rewritten what power meant. Still, some resisted. A few empires lingered, bitter and crumbling, hoping that one day memory would fade again. They whispered in shadows, plotted in forgotten stations, waiting for fatigue to win. But they never gained ground, not because of human strength, but because the galaxy had changed. Now, when someone tried to bury history, others spoke up. Not just humans. Everyone. Humanity had lit a fire that couldn't be extinguished, not by war, not by time. A final event sealed it. Decades after the war, on a distant moon that had once housed a massacre erased from records, an interspecies memorial was constructed, not by Earth, not by a government, but by civilians, survivors, descendants, scholars, and those who simply refused to forget. They built it together, a monument not of grandeur, but of names. Millions of them, some human, most not, all victims of a galaxy that once thought silence was peace. And at the base of the monument, one phrase was carved into the stone, in hundreds of languages, human and alien alike. A phrase that had echoed in every broadcast, every plea, every moment of resistance. Remember, or it will happen again. That phrase became the oath sworn by future leaders, not of Earth, but of every world that chose truth over comfort. It was written into education, into diplomacy, into law. Memory, once feared, was now sacred. And in that reverence, the galaxy finally found something like peace, not perfect, not eternal, but aware. And for humanity, that was enough, because in the end, they had never sought to be feared. They had only wanted the stars to remember what fear had cost them all.